Hello world, I am Curtis Simpson, and this is the Jectives flip-through book review of Ellen Lupton's Thinking with Type, 3rd edition. I do have a previous video on this book. It's my very first video on this Jectives channel, and it does a much more concise version of what I'm going to do today, which is try to convince you that this is a book worth reading. This will be a subjective review, but I'm going to give you objectively, every page in this, we're going to flip through it and you can see what the book's really about and make a decision for yourself. That first video, though, is why I think that everyone should read this book. This is going to be an entire full book review showing you everything that this book has to offer. The book only comes in paperback, so there's no hardback version available to purchase. There is an ebook version of this, and while I don't recommend buying it, you could check to see if your local library has it, because I was able to borrow this through either Libby or Hoopla with my library in Las Vegas. I do recommend the physical version though, and I'll point out some of the reasons about why I think the physical version is better. One thing the digital version, the ebook, has going for it that this doesn't is that there's not going to be a glare on the pages of the ebook, whereas this physical copy, the pages are very glossy and the print is very shiny as well. It's very reflective. So I constantly found myself trying to get a good angle on the book to read it without the glare. I've done my best to set up the lighting here to look good, but there's just no way getting around that. So that's the one thing that I do think the ebook has going for it, aside from, portability. Obviously, physical books take up space, and this one is no exception. Opening things up here. The front and back covers both have this nice little insert fold out with all of the typefaces, some of the typefaces that are in the book. It might be all of them, but I think probably some of them. This book was originally written in 2004. This version came out in 2024. So 20 years later, this 3rd edition came out. I've read all 3 versions of it, and this is the best one. The first reason why this is the best one is because the structure of the book is much better. Just the quality of life in this book is head and shoulders above the previous 2 versions of this book. The structure makes more sense in terms of the topics, the order of the topics, but then also each of these bold sections here have introductions to the chapters. So you get a much better idea of what's to come rather than just kind of hitting one thing after the other with no real guidance as to what's coming. The pages are very nice though, even though they're glossy, but they're nice and heavy. And I think one thing about the glossy pages that is a positive is that these reproductions look beautiful. This one's pretty small, but we got some bigger ones in here, and they all look amazing. The reason they all look amazing is thanks to this right here. Many thanks to Letterform Archive for the stunning photographs of historical works. If you don't know, go look at Letterform Archive. They have some incredible, an incredible archive of typographic works and things like that. Quick introduction here. It is what it is. Introductions, most of the time you can skip them. If you read the previous versions, maybe you'll find that interesting. But for our purposes here, we're not going to linger on it too much. Here's a perfect example, though, and I'll get into some others, of why the reproductions in this one are so much better. If you've ever read any archived books, sometimes they're perfect full color scans like this. Sometimes they are edited black and white versions. In previous editions of the book, many of these historical examples are edited. So like previously, this page here wasn't a full page from the Gutenberg Bible. It was like an edited L cut out of these words. It had white background, stark black text. You didn't get any of this color in here, none of this red and blue, none of the nice yellowed pages. It just doesn't give you a full context and connection to the historical work. The next big upgrade, in my opinion, is the use of red throughout the book. These red words here, they're each keywords that are going to be found in the index. And let's look for one here, calligraphy. So you come back here, obviously we're doing this backwards, but if you were going to look through, you'd find calligraphy, right? calligraphy, and it tells you a bunch of different pages there. It talks about calligraphy. But then you flip to one of those pages, calligraphy is in red. So there's no hunting around trying to find the calligraphy section in the book. They're highlighted in red, so they're very easy to find. Previous versions of this book, the captions would be red. Any random thing on the page would be red. So you're reading through it and constantly your eye is drawn over to this red because human eyes are drawn to red, they're drawn to yellow. So I think that using red here much more intentionally is a great upgrade in this book. Here's one of the reasons why the physical edition is better, and this is such a minor reason, but these actually make some sort of sense in the physical edition. In the digital version, they're just nice to have, but in the physical edition, flipping through leads you to the 3 sections of the book. So it's just kind of a nice little utility. Not that it adds a ton, but it does add something, and it's something that you're not going to get in the in the digital version of the book. The text in this book is very large, almost too large. I don't think that it actually is too large, but it's right on the edge. I think if she bumped this up one more point, it would be too large. But right now, I think it's very comfortable. I think it's very accessible. And I think almost everyone is going to have a good time reading this. If you do have vision impairments, that's another reason to get the ebook. You can put that on the screen and make it as big as you need to make it. Some more great, beautiful examples in here. And this is another addition to the book that I'll get into later. There's a full chapter on non-Latin typography, but you're getting a preview right from the jump here that it's not all about Latin typography in this 3rd edition. And that is one of the biggest additions to this edition. The next upgrade, which is also sadly a downgrade, is that we've got inline citations. So these are great. You've got a little cross here. I think you can see that. Little cross here points to this little cross here for this caption. It gives you further reading. These are amazing because when you're in the middle of a chapter, you get this direct link right here. It gives you further reading. Previous editions of the book did have some call outs like this, and this is a downgrade in my opinion, and I think objectively as well. The previous editions of this book had a bibliography in it. This one doesn't have that. It just has the index, and that's it. Luckily for us, I went through, and as I read this the second time, I wrote down on note cards every single one of these citations, and I'm going to have content, that kind of goes over every book that was mentioned in this book. But I do think that that's a major downgrade and a step backwards, because having a book like Thinking with Type and having just a bibliography in the back that gives you more to go to all in one place, not having to go through 250 pages of a book to find further reading. I don't know. It's only a few pages that need to be added, and we've added like 40 pages of non-Latin typography. I just think that that's the biggest question mark I have about this book. Why take out the bibliography? But like I said, almost everything else in this is an upgrade. One fun thing, this is going to be what a lot of this turns into being, is me talking about things that I appreciate. One thing that I did not know, italic letters introduced in 15th century Italy. I didn't realize, I never put 2 and 2 together, maybe you haven't either. Italic letters came from Italy. I mean, it's literally in the word, italic. I don't know how I never made this connection. After years and years and years of being in typography, being in design, studying in school, no one pointed this out to me. But the third time, the 3rd edition reading this, I've read this book more than 3 times, but the 3rd edition, it finally hit me. Here's another example of what I think is an upgrade. 2 of these are lorem ipsum, technically lorem paterum, but 2 of these are actual excerpts, actual scans of Golden Type and Jensen, Nicholas Jensen. I think that these are great, and I wish that these 2 here, I know that these are modern typefaces, but I still wish that these would have been actual excerpts from anything, literally anything, because I think that this does such a better job of showcasing the typefaces. So I really appreciate these 2. The Harry Potter, lorem ipsum is fun, but I wish that these would also be real examples. This is another example, though, of an improvement in the structure of this book. There's a few different ways the structure of this book is better, and one of them is this. It's just a simple grid. This column is the examples. This column is about each of the typefaces. It makes so much more sense. If you go look at some of the older editions of the book, this would be really messy, and there'd be all kinds of different sections, and you'd have captions that are right aligned, captions that were left aligned. And this is much more easy to get through, much more easy to understand. And I think that that's what you need in an educational book like this, where you're learning something new. You don't want to fight with what you're trying to read. Another cool little thing that I found in here that I was not familiar with prior is the King's Roman. I don't speak French, so I'm not going to try to pronounce that. But this is a typeface that was commissioned by Louis XIV of France in 1695. And I've seen this diagram before, but it never struck me like that a king designed a typeface. You know, we're so used to now brands and even individuals commissioning typefaces. I wonder what the backstory is on this. And I talked about seeds in the very first video about this book. Go watch that one. But this planted a seed for me where, like, I want to know more. I want to know why he did this. Was he super into typography? Was there some courtier that like convinced him that this was a good investment? Did some other king have their own typeface and he wanted his? I just really want to know where this came from and why it was created. It's super cool, but I want to learn more. And that's one of the things I think this book does really well, is encouraging you to want to learn more about typography. It will get you excited about typography 100%. We're going to start burning through a lot of different art periods and design periods, and each of them are worth looking into on their own, but they just get kind of a passing glance here. So you can see some of the highlights: arts and crafts, futurism, Dada, de Stijl, constructivism. That's one thing this book does really well. And I don't know if there's necessarily a downside, because how much can you really get into each one of these topics? But it gives you an introduction into each bigger topic that you could go explore on your own. And so if there's something that really strikes your fancy as you're going through, I think that's what this book does a really good job at, is kind of like introducing you to things that you might not have been aware of before. So there are a lot of art movements that we're going to kind of go through, a lot of design movements that we're going to go through. And this is another example of something that was completely different in this reproduction here is completely different in the second edition of the book, because previously this was just a white background. You didn't have like the stamped, or not stamped, but like the pasted pieces of papers where they had like replaced the A, replaced the S 2 times, replaced, put this alternate A on here, the alternate Ds. There's something cool about, like, it's not tangible. You can't hold this piece of paper in your hands, but it's almost tangible. It connects the human to these pieces of design, this typography. And you can imagine someone pasting that D on there. And I think having that connection just makes it feel more like, oh yeah, a human did this. One of the upgrades from this book, the third edition, is that the order makes more sense. And there's just a lot of little things like this that add up. And the description of the typeface is here, the history of it. And then we see the typeface. Description, typeface. Susanna Licko, she's a rabbit hole worth diving down. We don't have enough time to talk about her here, but Google that name and you will find some very cool stuff. Variable fonts. This is one of the reasons why this book exists. Type changes when technology changes. And it's not that variable fonts didn't exist, but they didn't exist in the current form that they do until 2016. And the previous edition of this book was printed in 2010. So if you only owned the first or second edition of this book and you were completely new to typography, you're going to be missing out on some very important current typography details like variable fonts. I could talk a lot about variable fonts, but I do think we're in an era right now where we're going to look back on typography, and we've been going through all of these different historical periods, and we're going to look at some different typefaces and things like that. I think variable fonts is one of the moments in typographic history where everything kind of changes. And we're just scratching the surface right now, I think, with variable fonts. But time will tell. But I just think that the technology of variable fonts is super cool, and there's some really cool, interesting stuff going on. But we just continue here. She's going through some different sections. So this was type as program, type as narrative, back to work. And she's giving some different examples and talking about the trends and stuff like that for a typography. So there's some really great examples in here. This book does lose a little bit of fun when it comes to Mrs. Eves, because Mrs. Eves, she kind of glosses over the Mrs. Eves conversation that we had in previous editions, where we find out that Mrs. Eves was actually like Baskerville's mistress turned wife. Like, she was his assistant and then became his wife. They lived together for a really long time. And you miss out on that fun sort of history where it would plant a seed probably for someone to go and read more about it, because that's what the second edition did for me. And again, this is Zuzanna Licco. So, we're looking back in the 80s here, 1985, and now we're seeing her again in 1996, 2009. So, like I said, Google her. But let's go ahead and move on. This is where we start to get even more of an introduction into non-Latin typography. And the first time I read this, I'll be honest, I was kind of like, okay, this is a book in English. I don't like, why do we need this? And then after reading it 2 times, I came to the conclusion that it actually is like a great introduction. And here's a perfect example why. So we all, if you're familiar with Latin typography, which I'm sure most of us are, the stress of a typeface generally goes vertically, right? So like this part of the R here is thicker going vertically than it is horizontally. In other typefaces or in other non-Latin typography, the stroke has a horizontal stress. So if you didn't know anything about non-Latin typefaces, maybe this sort of inspiration would never come to you. And I don't think that this necessarily is the most readable typography by David Jonathan Ross, another great type designer to go look into. But this type of inspiration may never spark itself if you don't expand your horizons or your typography education outside of Latin typefaces. Here are one of the introductions that I was talking about before that give you like an introduction to a section. So if we just go back to the table of contents real quick, you can see anatomy. So every time you see one of those bold sections, you're going to get one of these gray pages that just gives an introduction and hits you with a few of the terms so you can kind of get an idea of what to expect in the chapter. This anatomy chart right here is not going to be super comprehensive. It's going to be great for a first timer. It's going to be great to just kind of get your feet wet. And I think for 90% of graphic designers, this will be more than enough. But if you want something super in-depth, go look at Karen Chung's Designing Type, and she will give you tons and tons more type anatomy. And since I don't speak any languages that are non-Latin, and neither does Ellen Lupton, by the way, you'll note that these say who they are written and designed by, and they are not her. I will get into this a little more later when we get to a bigger section about non-Latin typography. But my point right now is that I don't know how comprehensive and how well done these anatomy sections are. I have to imagine they're at least up to this quality. But if you are a native speaker or at least educated on these other typefaces, go ahead and leave a comment and let us all know how well this is done. Do I think that this is something that type students are going to be quizzed on, tested on? No. But this is a nice introduction to non-Latin typography in terms of anatomy. And if you're ever working internationally or you're working with another type designer or graphic designer, it'd be nice to just be able to like know what to call the different types or the different pieces of typography. So not incredibly useful for a type 101 student, one of my critiques, but I think in the general sense, it is nice to have a little bit of an introduction to non-Latin typography. Maybe this will be super compelling to you. Maybe you will gloss right over these. I think most people, after reading this for the first time, probably won't really look at these pages again. So now we are on to typefaces and fonts. And if we look at the introduction here, you can get an idea of what we're going to be talking about. Previously, we were talking about the letters, and talking about anatomy, a little bit of history. Here we're going to be talking about fonts, typefaces, the height, width, classifying, choosing typefaces, type families, italic, numerals, optical sizes, all kinds of stuff. Even right here, we get a look at like, what would 4 divided by 6 be? We're getting a look at like 4 out of 6 fonts from the Vignelli canon, and you can see a little bit of an introduction to some classification here, because we're getting to see different details of the serifs and the angled stress and high contrast stroke and small apertures, large apertures, getting all these details, and you can start to see how things are going to build upon themselves. This page here has a surprising amount of stuff packed into it, this spread, because I think the M square and like M's and rims, I think this is much more important than it might appear at first glance. And one of the biggest reasons is this right here. We have 28 point Verdana and we have 36 point Lacquer Bold. And you can see that they're filling up these squares much differently. I'm trying to think of what we would call this, like text block, or this text box here. I guess we'll just call it a text box. You can see they fill up the box much differently, where you've got this big empty space here, and then, with Lacquer Bold, we have a big empty space at top. If you've ever set type and you've changed the font, or you tried to put two different typefaces together, you'll notice that like a 12-point font for one typeface and a 12 points in another typeface might be wildly different. And not only that, they might fill up these text boxes different, so they might not align as well as you would hope they do. This explains why that is. I think this is a great page right here at sort of demonstrating X height. And X height is definitely one of the things that gives typefaces the most character, and it's one of the most defining things outside of like the general classification in terms of the period that it existed or what it's trying to replicate. But you can see here, I think this does a really good job because all of the A's are the same. The crossbars on the A's are pretty much similar, but the X height here of the lowercase a is drastically different, especially from, what are we looking at, Dito to Tiempos. So I think this is really good at showing you the difference in X height, and she does a great job here too. I think these diagrams work very well. And then we go even a step further, we're kind of looking at sort of like headlines, subheads and stuff like that. Then we get into text. So it's just body copy, and these 4 here, they just repeat themselves, which in this instance, I do think is a good choice because then we can compare them 1-to-1. And you can see the smaller X heights of Eureka, the bigger X heights of Tiempos. So Eureka is the red here, and then Tiempos. So it's not even that dramatic, right? But then when you look at it in a larger setting, I think even on the screen right now, you can see how much of a difference this makes. Then we get into the width. This is one of the rules, right? We don't actually squish typography. Once you know this rule, you can break this rule. But for the most part, I never squish my typography. I just go look for a condensed typeface that's been well designed. But obviously we're breaking some rules here, right? Monospace. It took Ellen Lupton 20 years, count them, to put monospace into this book. And I did see her give a presentation. I just saw it online. I saw the recording, but I saw her give a presentation about the time that this book was released. And she made kind of a snarky comment about people being upset that monospace wasn't in the previous editions, and finally she's included it. But monospace existed before a lot of other type, in the modern sense, when we're talking about typewriters, we're talking about coding, monospace is just so present in our lives. The fact that it was not included from 2004 until 2024 seems crazy. Finally, it's here. Even cooler, and this is something that was not included, but isn't brand new, is unit width. And I think right now we're still trying to settle on what we're going to call this, because I was actually looking at a font that was released recently and it was called Multiplexed. So I think unit width is hands down the best one, but you might see unit width, equal width, duplexed, or multiplexed. Basically what we're looking at is that no matter what weight it is, it takes up the same amount of space. Each character takes up the same amount of space. But unlike monospace, where the M and the I both take up the same amount of space, every letter takes the same amount of space, but even the skinny letters and the wide letters take up the same amount of space. This one, each character gets its own space, but it's equal throughout the font. So we can see here the I and the W take up vastly different amounts of space, but the I always has the same M square. The W always has the same M square. And I think that's really cool. I don't know, there are practical uses for each of these things. Kinetic typography is where I see this a lot of times, but I think this could work really great in UI design. This could work really great in spreadsheets. So it's really cool. And it's something that honestly, I wasn't super familiar with, prior to reading this third edition of the book. Now we get into typeface classifications, and much like Karen Chung's Designing Type, she pointed out we are at a point in time where this, we still use these terms, but they're not, I think Ellen Lupton calls them like slippery at best. And I think that's a perfect example or a perfect description of them, because yes, if we're looking at like specific typefaces like these, like Saban, Baskerville, Dido, Clarendon, these are easy to classify, but there are a lot of typefaces, especially modern ones, that just they don't fit into a class perfectly. And I don't know. So she points out, which I like and some people hate. I like that she points it out because I know people hate it. Is that a lot of font platforms now use adjectives, and they're basically like vibe classifying, which I think makes more sense. So she's got rounded, luxury, funky, fun. So you go type in fun, and then you gives you a bunch of typefaces that are like fun, rather than saying, give me a modern typeface. When, is it modern? Is it just a serif? Is it a slab serif? Is it, clearly we do have like a period, but now that we're creating reproductions of these, I don't know, classification is very difficult. Still worth learning, because then you can talk about them. You can know what to look for. You can understand the history. You can understand when you're looking for a typeface, you can understand how it's been used previously and in what periods of history it was used, who designed it, things like that, where modern fonts are taking inspiration from. But we are kind of moving past these classical classifications. I like this. I like that this here is not just lorem ipsum that's been repeated, 8 times, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 times. Instead, it's a little bit of a history about each font, and you're seeing the font used right next to it. So Clarendon is written in Clarendon, but it gives you some history. So it says the typeface Clarendon was introduced by Thorogood and Co. in London, 1845. Cool. Like, I think that's much more compelling, and that's one thing that this version of the book does much better, and it's why I say that the third edition is the best edition. We're getting into some more classifications here, and there it is, slippery. I think the tips for choosing typefaces is one of the best sections in the book, and I know that I keep saying I think this, I think that. This is the review, and I'm going to point out a lot of things that I think are great, but I'm actually going to read each of these because I think it's worth it. I think that a lot of times when we're choosing typefaces, we're not choosing typefaces for the right reason, and it's good to step back and remind ourselves of these. So, as quick as I can, ask what will readers do with your content? Read, wander, scan, buy, sell, customize. What functions do you need? Space efficiency, language support, multiple styles. Ask what voice or attitude do you want to convey to readers? Confidence, candor, mystery, authority, intimacy. Test different typefaces with sample content from your project. What feels right? Read typeface reviews and subscribe to design newsletters. Subscribe to objectives. Inspect the code on websites that you like. The last one, not super useful, I don't think, except for discovering new typefaces, which is cool. But these first three here, it really puts into perspective that you need to think about how the font is being used, how typeface is being used, what is the context, who's going to be using it, what does it need to do. It's not just about what's trendy. It's not just about what looks good to you. It's about what the readers need, what the users need, where this is going to be. Is this going to be on a business card, or is this going to be on signage on the highway? Because they're completely different and they have different interactions, different use cases, different needs. And I think especially for a beginner, this is great, great instruction. It's only 3, I don't count the last one. It's only 3 tips, but they're super solid and they point you in the right direction about how you should be choosing typefaces. So she goes through a little more about choosing typefaces, pairing typefaces. I think this is an upgrade as well. I think that previously she was a little bit more prescriptive in how to combine typefaces. And then here I feel like she's a little more vibe based. I think that just goes with, the changes in culture, but I do think that it's a good change. And this is going to be one of the upgrades, or at least benefits, to purchasing the 3rd edition over the 2nd or the 1st, is that you're going to get more up to date, relevant sort of like, here's how typography is being done in 2024, 2025. The old books are cool though, and they'll be particularly cool in another 20 years when they're like 40 years old. In 2044, it'll be awesome if you own the 1st edition of this book. But for a Type 101 student, you want to be up to date. You want to be looking at the best version that you can. 2 more pages that are incredibly useful that I don't think were included in previous versions, but I could be wrong on that. Font formats and license and Libre fonts, and they go hand in hand. Font formats, you can look that up on your own. There are different formats that are used for print and web, and you'll have to look and see what's best for you. But end user license agreements, understanding font licensing is going to save you a world of hurt if you understand it from the beginning. At least get like an understanding in the sense of like knowing that you're not purchasing a typeface unless you're actually purchasing the rights to it. You are licensing this font. You don't own it. You can't give it away. You can't just steal a font from anywhere and use it. You need to purchase it, or it needs to be open source, an open font license. There's a lot of things in between these two. I'm simplifying it quite a bit. But what the point I'm trying to make is that please understand font license. I'm glad that this is included here. It just scratches the surface. You're definitely going to need to go and research more about it when it comes to using fonts and projects and things like that, especially anything where you're going to make money. Until you understand that though, look for SIL open font licenses. Anything on Google Fonts is going to be this. Anything on Font Squirrel is going to be this. You can go and use these fonts, and they're going to be high quality, especially on Google and Font Squirrel, and other places too. But you can use these fonts however you need to use them. Until you understand licensing, SIL open font license are going to be your best friend. As the book progresses, we start to see, we start to learn more about, like, we talked about how to choose a typeface. Now we're going to learn more about actual type families, things like that. So start to talk about type families, and we'll learn about all the different weights. We'll learn about the different styles with the condensed, the italic. There's a lot of great information in here that's going to point you in the right direction. Super families are going to be incredibly useful if you're not good at combining typefaces, because basically what you can do is, we have this here, but previously we saw Mrs. Eves, right? There was Mrs. Eves and there's Mr. Eves, and you can combine those two perfectly. You're going to have a sans serif, you're going to have a serif. You can do that with several different super families. It says Adele here has a dozen fonts in multiple weights and widths, while Scala provides a more bookish range of options. I don't know why I read that. But basically, you've got these super families that are going to be comprised of fonts like this. Here's a perfect example. Scala Sans, and Scala Jewel. I think Scala Jewel is super cool, and I hope we can get some more fun typography like this combined with the serious faces. You know, typically we get like either this or this. We don't get a lot of fun display typefaces that are built into part of a fuller typeface family. And this is one of the benefits of super families. So if you don't know how to combine typefaces, or you're not super comfortable, you're not confident, super families are going to help you quite a bit. This page here is another great example of what this book does. Gives you a little bit of an introduction into capital letters, which, like, who would even think that there would be 2 pages on capital letters by themselves? There are probably full books written about capital letters, but she gives you an introduction to it here. She shows you like historical example, you know, where capital letters originated from. Then she's giving you 2 real world examples and breaking down why they work. Excellent. And then here she's giving you one of the type crimes that we're not calling type crimes anymore. And it's small capitals. So another great thing she does is she'll show you a mistake and then show you the correct way to do it. So even if you've never made this mistake, or maybe you have and you didn't know it, using false small caps versus real small caps. You can see the word power there versus the word power here. One just looks markedly better. In a lot of old typography, you'll see stuff like this. And it's just because, you know, many fonts didn't have small caps and people weren't educated or didn't have access to fonts with small caps. So there's stuff like that sprinkled throughout the entire book that's worth looking at. Italics is another one where you've got faux italics and things like that. False italics, she's got them here. But yeah, that's one thing that this book is excellent at, is showing you things that you might not have thought of and explaining why they work and why the mistakes don't work. Here we're looking at, you know, old style numerals versus lining numerals, tabular, proportional. There are just a lot of great examples and a lot of great use cases that are explained in this book for so many tiny things that if you weren't educated in design, you weren't educated in typography, you hadn't read a book like this, you would never think about. You know, here's a great example, right? You'll probably see signs like this where these are hatch marks. This is for foot, this is for inches, where those are used instead of apostrophes or quotes. Now, some typefaces, like Helvetica, well, Helvetica's got them right there, don't they? There's some typefaces, Helvetica, I guess, was a bad example. There are some typefaces that actually have hatch marks, and they are the quote marks, or the apostrophes. So it's not a tried and true principle, but when your font does have both things, you want to be using the right one. I've debated, I'm going to just make the call here in the moment, I guess. I've debated about whether or not I wanted to cover this spread here, because I do think that it's a little bit maybe divisive, but I'm going to try to be as objective as possible and just kind of play this out. The main thing that we're looking at here is what they're calling the gender star. And I think actually in German it's pronounced however this word is pronounced, but I don't speak German. Basically, we're looking at how punctuation can be used as gender inclusive language. Design is typically supposed to simplify things, make things be easy. I don't think that this objectively simplifies anything. And maybe people in Germany can correct me, but we've got driver male, driver female, and then this one here is driver for all genders. So instead of just using one or the other or a completely new word, we're combining both the words together and putting a star in there that you have to pause to pronounce. I don't know. Is this easier? Is this useful? You can be the judge of that. I think instead of saying actor or actress, we can just use one word. Like if people are offended by using actor and actress, I know these are driver, but I'm trying to think of something in English. Like if people are offended that we're using two different ones, let's just use one word. We don't need to say actor and then make a pause and then say S, right? Can we just, I don't know. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe I'm right. Time will tell. Or maybe it's subjective and there will be no right or wrong. Optical sizes. This is something that's really cool that might not be evident right off the bat. And it's probably like you've probably seen these different labels on fonts before, but maybe you didn't necessarily know what they were for. So when you see display, text, or micro, these are optical sizes and they help you understand what context the font was designed to be used in. So micro could be used at very, very small sizes. And you can see how it looks better at small sizes compared to display, which is designed to be really, really big. And then text is supposed to be, text that you're going to read. So it's just a good professional type designer created these for specific things. And you can always break the rules, but using display font at like tiny micro sizes, probably not a great choice. You can always use a micro at like a big size because legibility isn't necessarily a problem in that setting, but you're going to get the nicest version of it at large sizes if you use the display version. So optical size is something to look into, but not something that's probably going to, I don't know. For a lot of people, it's probably not going to be like a day-to-day thing. More examples here. Variable fonts. We start to get into some of the modern technology we were talking about before. And she does make a point here, like, so with variable fonts, you're likely still going to get, see if I can get the glare off of this. You're likely still going to get each of the weights designed. It's very unlikely that a type designer is going to make like the thinnest and the widest and just be like, you go ahead and do whatever you want in between. No, they're making each one of these and then they're using algorithms to adjust these so that the sizing between them is perfect. And there might be some hand adjustments too, but she points out here that it's unlikely that you ever actually need to use like 450, which is between regular and medium, but it's there. And what it does very well is helps with kinetic typography, where you want the font to get wider or you want it to get bolder or thinner. Or turn into italic, or any of these things. It makes that sort of kinetic typography. I wish I could think of a better word for it. It makes that kind of UI and stuff a little bit easier to do. We're looking at some more variable fonts here, and that's what I was talking about before, where I think that like these custom axes for typography is just going for variable fonts is just going to like open up a world of typography that we haven't even imagined yet. And parametric fonts, this is one thing that I was really thinking about when I was reading Designing Type by Karen Chung, is like, why don't we have this? And we do have this, obviously, where like the X height could be smaller. Like you could raise the ascenders, lower the descenders, like raise the X height, lower the X height. And it's just amazing to see that this does exist. And this is really what I think is going to be. These types of variable fonts, I think, are what's going to be the future of variable fonts. Ornaments. This is one where I've gone back and forth, where I just don't know if ornaments, I don't know that I agree that ornaments are typography. Are they used side by side with typography? Were they originally printed on the same, pressed on the same lead pieces that typefaces were to create, beautiful designs like this? Yeah, of course they were. But just because something is in a font format, does that make it typography? I don't know. Like these Whirligigs by Susanna Licco, we see her again. These exist in a font file, but does that make them typography? I don't know. I think that it's more likely that they're being used to sort of like hack a font file, prior to when it was like convenient to be able to use SVG, vector symbols and things like that. And it's still very useful to have stuff like this included in your typefaces, especially arrows and things like that. But I don't know. I'm torn. What do you guys think? Are ornaments the same thing as typography, or is this something different that's just being kind of included? I think it's kind of adjacent, but I don't know. I could be convinced either way. Lettering. There is this sort of relationship between lettering and typography. And a lot of times they get confused online, especially by people not in the industry. But I think that lettering deserved more than 3 paragraphs in this entire book. At least like explain the difference to people, at least give a definition. I think this spread could have been much better. But you know, it is what it is. There is an interesting relationship between lettering and typography though, because obviously typography, for the most part, derives from lettering, or at least handwriting. And then we've kind of moved into where there's this back and forth between the two of them where they build off of each other. I think should have been explored a little bit more here. But it wasn't. Designing typefaces. See, this is where you kind of go hand in hand. And I do think this is a good progression. I think it's a great progression to go from lettering to designing typefaces, because they are completely different, but in ways they're very, very similar. Because you could take this and turn it into a typeface if you had the skills, but a typeface needs to be able to exist in a font file. You need to be able to type it out. It needs to fit with the letters. You know, you need to have good spacing and things like that. And this isn't going to teach you how to design a typeface in this single spread here. But it does give you a sort of bit of an introduction and kind of points you in the right direction. And she also gives you further reading here, but I think a great place to start, like I said, is Karen Chung's Designing Type, which just so happens to be a book that I have done a flip through review of on this channel. Exercises. The exercises in this book are something that I could give or take. Like they don't really appeal to me at this point in my career. But I can see how they could be useful for a classroom. You know, teachers might not know what to assign. They might not be able to come up with a good assignment. So this is going to be better than nothing. But I think if you're self-learning, you can do these, but you're really going to need to seek out the opinion or the critique of experienced designers or typographers. Otherwise, you're just going to kind of do something and then not learn from it. But in a classroom setting, I could see these being useful. I don't know that I like these better than the second edition, though, because the second edition actually had some case studies in the back, whereas these are mostly student work. So I don't know what the decision was there, but that's what it is. Like I said, it's not a make or break for me, so we'll go ahead and move on. Now that we understand a little bit about typography, we understand some font classifications, we understand how to use our typefaces, we start moving into how typefaces exist within text. So like this, we're not looking at just like the words, not just looking at just the font files anymore, not looking at how they're designed, we're looking at how they're actually used. Linearity is a super cool subject that I'm not going to get into here, but my other video does talk about that a little bit. What I think was worth talking about here is the user. So this idea that when we use typography, there's another person that is going to be using that typography. Whether it's on a website, whether it's reading a book, we have to think about the person that's going to be reading that and how they matter. And I think that concept's super cool, but again, not a ton of time to cover that here. But it will play into things like this, aligning columns. And part of this is just going to be the perspective of thinking about what we want the user to get out of this, what's going to be easiest for them to read, what's going to give the right impression, what's going to be the right voice. But I think this page, again, I repeat myself often, but I think this page here does a great job, and it's a great example of what this book does very well. Aligning columns, something we've all done since we were old enough to click the 4 different options on a word processing program. Centered, justified, flush left, flush right. She gives great examples here because we're seeing them actually used, right? We're seeing the typography written out so you can see it at a glance, but then she talks about it. So this isn't just dummy text. She talks about when this is useful, when it's not. Then she gives like a little bit of a description, kind of breaks it down a little bit more. And then you have this nice little icon here that again reinforces what we're looking at and the fact that we have all clicked these buttons. Just to look at one of them, we're looking at centered text here, and she's talking about like symmetrical, like the facade of a classical building. This style often appears on invitations, title pages, certificates, and gravestones. So she's talking about how it can be used for like this dramatic stuff. And, prior to like the Swiss movement, a lot of stuff was centered on the page, and justified and centered depending on if you're doing title pages or the actual script that you're reading. But then we kind of switched to this flush left because it's got a much more balanced approach in the sense of there's no weird spacing. So you can see this one here, there are bigger gaps between those. When you've got it flush left, it's always nice and even when you read. But centered here, she's talking about how it's like formal and classical, but you have to be careful because sometimes that could be too like solemn and can be too much like a tombstone. Maybe you don't want it to be like that. So I think that it's simple, but it really gets the point across. And I think that's the most important thing with an introductory book like this. And then she's got some great real world examples here. Centered, justified, multiple alignments. So you can do a flush left, flush right together. This one's a multiple alignments. You're probably not going to be able to see it, but I'm going to try to point it out. They're very subtly aligned right there. And you can kind of see there's like this intentional river, but it's so small that at first glance, you might not notice it. I don't know what the context here. I'm not sure why it's being done, but it's kind of cool. Multiple alignments because we've also got multiple languages here. Same with this one. That's what this book does really good. It kind of explains something, shows you good examples. Here we're looking at line length. We've seen this. We saw this in the grid systems book. And she gives examples about what's good, what's bad. Paragraphs. There's something really cool here. And again, this kind of comes back to the linearity that I mentioned earlier, but it says humans speak in sentences, but not in paragraphs. And it's one of those things that like, once you read it, you're like, oh, duh. But prior to reading that, like, have you ever thought about the fact that paragraphs only exist in printed like Word? I don't know. And this is what breaks up the linearity because we don't have to read a whole paragraph. We can start reading it. No, that's not what I want. Start to this one. No, that's not what I want. Oh, here we go. This is what I want. I want to learn about the M space or whatever we're trying to get through. Like paragraphs and headers and captions and page numbers. These all help like scan a page, see if that's what we want to read or if it's not. I talked about this in my Seeds video as well. I keep saying Seeds video. I'm talking about the first Thinking with Type video that I made. But if someone was telling a story, you just have to listen to everything they say. You couldn't scan a page quickly like this and see what you want to see. I think most of us are using this because we're online all the time and it's just the easiest way to separate paragraphs. But the classic, would be to indent. And she's got some outdents here, the deep indent. This is a no-no. This is one we're not going to do. And then you've got little paragraph markers. And sometimes you'll see the little paragraph symbol, but sometimes you'll see just, abstract markers like this. And while we do typically use this, or if we're reading a novel or something, you get that, we've got the indents here. It is cool, and it's a good reminder to see other examples of how to break up paragraphs. This is another section where not necessarily like silliness, but there's a little bit of like cultural influence into this. And this one I think does make more sense than some of the previous examples we've seen. But she makes it a case for moving away from calling widows and orphans and calling them short lines and bad breaks. I would prefer whatever is most descriptive, and widows and orphans were never descriptive. I never knew which one was which. I think saying like short line and bad page break, like these make bad column break. These make more sense than just bad break. I don't know. Once you learn one, I guess it would make sense. The entire case here, learn what bad breaks and short lines are. But the entire case here is made much better when you learn what, like, in Sweden and German they were calling these, because it was basically like, let's see, it was calling it like a bastard or a child of a whore rather than like orphan and widow. Like, she makes the case that orphan and widow are demeaning. And when I read that, I was kind of like, okay, yeah, I guess if you were an orphan or a widow, I could understand how you could be like, hey, why are you bringing me into this? But then you get to this one and it's like the child of a whore or a bastard. That's just crazy. So I'm on board. And then these here are examples of sort of these designers making their case for like why we should change the words. And I think that they've more or less successfully done that. But I think it's really cool how you can use typography to change these things. And if you're someone that, disagrees with me or disagrees with whoever, you can use typography to change the minds of people sometimes, and you can at least use it to like make your case. Kerning, everyone's favorite thing to point out the mistakes online. Good kerning is amazing. Bad kerning is always, obviously going to look bad. A good typeface is going to be spaced in a way that you should never actually need to kern body copy. If you need to kern text, pick a different typeface. But sometimes you'll need to kern headlines just to make them look a little tighter and nicer. I think she makes the case well enough here, but I think that the examples here are a swing and a miss. I don't like that she put all of these little red lines and circles. Maybe you can't see it too well on the screen, but I find like these circles, they're just distracting. Trust the reader and let us see the space here rather than putting these lines, because now these lines are here. It makes it to where the space seems less significant. It doesn't let me see the full gap because there's these red lines. Small critique, but I do think it's an important one because you're talking about helping beginner typographers understand these things. And I don't think the hand holding here helps very much. Some more spacing, tracking lowercase. She actually does track lowercase earlier in the book. And I was going to point it out, but we only have so much time here. This is already a long video, but she points out here, like, you should never really track. And by track, I mean spread out all of the lowercase letters. That's really much more of an uppercase game, if you will. And it can look very nice when uppercase letters are spread out. Go look at like the Louis Vuitton logo, it's Futura, and Nike is also Futura, but Nike's like super tight tracking and italic. And then Louis Vuitton's Futura is like this very wide, like tracked out, luxurious, sort of like takes much longer to read. It's the luxury of time, whereas Nike is like strong and fast, so it's italic. It's very interesting how you can use tracking and spacing in general to convey completely different meanings. A little bit more about tracking here. Let me just go back one page because I want to point out this here. This tiny little unassuming box here is much more important than you might think. And we're never going to see like a dark mode book because that's just silly. I'm sure they exist, but yeah, it's just silly and it's a huge waste of ink. But a lot of people enjoy dark mode on their devices, whether that's your PC, MacBook, phone. A lot of people like dark mode. It's important to note that typefaces traditionally were designed to be dark text on light backgrounds. So you need to think about potentially positive tracking for your dark mode when you're going to be using white on black. Even better than that, look for a typeface, which I'm going to be talking about one in a future video. Look for a typeface that has been designed for dark mode, because they do exist because of this problem where type just doesn't really work when it's reversed. It doesn't work as well. Obviously it works because we see it all the time, right? But when a typeface is designed, in positive when it's designed for black text on white background or something where it's dark on light. It doesn't necessarily work in dark mode. So something to be aware of. And it's something that's obviously new to this book. Maybe that's not obvious. It's something that's new to the 3rd edition. And I think it's very worth recognizing. Vertical space, we're looking, a lot of the spacing stuff is all very similar in idea. And then she kind of breaks it down for like why this matters and what the best ways to do it are. Obviously you can see this is the leading here is way too tight. And then maybe this leading here is the right size for you, but this is what she's saying is like the nice place to start. And then, when you're working with multiple typefaces, if you use the auto spacing, use the auto leading, you're going to get something like this that isn't quite as pleasing because you get these big gaps that are like 120 or 150% between these two, and then no gap because you've just got your 150 or 120 there. So if you set these yourself, you can get a nice breakdown. I don't hate the lines here, but I do think that not having the lines would probably demonstrate this a little bit better because the lines I do find are distracting once again. But you can see she's shown here. She's showing you some more examples of how to use vertical spacing, baseline shifts, things like this. Very important to learn, and some great examples. Vertical text. If you are Chinese, Japanese, Korean reader, you're very familiar with vertical text. But for Latin characters, not every typeface is going to work well vertically. And there are certain typefaces like Bungee by David Jonathan Ross, another great designer. Maybe I've mentioned that already. That are particularly specifically designed for stacking like this. They're made for vertical. This is Bungee right here, and it looks beautiful. Whereas if you took something like Baskerville, it's not going to look great on its own. You're going to have to do a lot of work. You're probably going to have to use a heavy weight. Like it just wasn't designed for that. So something to be aware of. Again, I think most of this book is just like an introduction to a ton of concepts, and then you learn more about it as you go in your career, and then you come back and you read the book again, and it makes more sense. Like watching a movie that you watch, you learn the twist ending, and then you watch it again, and you're like, oh, I can piece things together now. That's why professionals should still come back and read this. This isn't just a book for beginners, but for beginners, I think that it's great to just give you an introduction to everything, and then you can kind of like pick up more on these things as you go. Legibility and readability, super important. I like how objective she is in this section because I see a lot of people promoting like hyperlegible. What's the one that's Atkinson hyperlegible? This came out a few years ago, 2019. And I see a lot of people just instinctively like promoting this, like this is the greatest font ever. Everyone needs to use this font. This is like everyone, if you're a good designer, you're going to use this because you care about accessibility and you care about this. Like, yeah, in the right setting, that makes sense. But she makes the case here that like hyperlegible can just be kind of exhausting to read because it's not like, I understand that you might, if you have vision impairments, it might be difficult to know the difference between these 3 or 4 letters here. Whereas this one is going to be much more legible, but this can just be a lot. Like I don't know how to say it. It's just not as pleasing to read. It's very distinctive and that's great, but it's just not as pleasing to read as, a well-designed typeface like Helvetica Neue or, any sans serif that's humanist or geometric. No one typeface is going to be perfect for every situation. And she makes the case for that here. There's a difference between legibility and there's a difference between readability. And it's important to understand the difference. And it's important to know when to use when, where. This spread here, readable prose, really brings out the author over the designer in Ellen Lupton here. And I think it's a good introduction into readable prose. And she does make a good point that we could all do a little bit better at improving our writing game. especially if we want to stand out among the onslaught of AI slop that is upon us. Another exercise that I could give or take, maybe you'll find these interesting, maybe you won't. I think after the first time you read this book, you'll never look at those pages again. But now we are on to hierarchy and structure. She does a great job in this section of demonstrating and explaining hierarchy and structure, and it really is one of the most important parts of graphic design and typography in general, because you need to be able to structure it. Like, you can't just choose a nice typeface. You can choose the best typeface on the planet Earth, but if you don't know how to structure it, if you don't know how to use hierarchy, then you're going to be in some real trouble. So she gives you a few different examples, if I can speak, of hierarchy, and we've got minimal, just one typeface, but then setting it in different sizes using the grid. We've got layered hierarchy, which I think is beautiful, though I don't particularly love the Sunday example. This is one that she's very excited about, and I can tell because she's made a ton of videos talking about it, and every presentation she does, she talks about this ice cream sundae. For me, this metaphorical analogy of typography as cherries and crunchy bits and stuff, like, I would prefer her just use real terms like she does in the other sections. This is very straightforward. This is not. And then we go back to, very straightforward, talking about like type scale. I thought there was another hierarchy in here. Minimal. I think we're going to get to some more when we get to grids. But I do think that these examples are great. And if this works for you, then that's great. If this makes sense. And you can kind of compare these two, and hopefully that'll help you out a little bit. But subjective, this is my review, so I'm going to tell you what I do and don't like. And that's one part that just didn't work for me. Type scale. You can see we're moving, you can see the progression. We're kind of talking about hierarchy and stuff like that, and then now it's like, okay, I want to do this layered hierarchy, I want to do this ice cream sundae thing. How do I choose what size fonts to use? Type scale. There are many different types of type scales. You've got your modular scales, where she's doing these based on like musical notation. You've got the golden ratio, and then you've got this historical type scale. And this is one of the funnest parts of this book, and it's only fun if you're a type nerd, but we've probably all seen these numbers, right? When it doesn't matter what program you're in, you click the size for the typeface and you're going to see these numbers. I have never seen the names for these numbers though. So I'm just going to read a few of them, but like 6 point is non-perial, 7 is Minion, 8 is Brevier or small text, 9 is Bourgeois. I'm probably not saying that right. I think it's French. 10 is long primer or Garamond. 11 is small pica or philosophy. Like, what are these? I know they're from, she gives a little bit of explanation here. They're from the historical type scale, like when it was actual like physical blocks of metal. But I think it's really cool. It'd be an interesting bit of trivia. But it's fun to see these things, and I don't know how accurate it is that people actually use these names, but she's saying that they are, so it would be funny to go back like 200 years ago and see some typesetter calling out like, give me the great primer, and then like his assistant goes and grabs the 18-point font. I don't know. Here we're getting some more hierarchy here. So like visual hierarchy, semantic hierarchy, you've probably come across this if you've ever done any web design, or if you've worked in like Notion or some markdown language or something, where you can set like your H1, H2, P, and then you can choose the typeface or the type treatment that's going to be used for that. So this is really cool and definitely super useful. If you're going to be designing websites, or even if you're going to be using InDesign or Affinity's Publisher, which I use. If you're going to be using Publisher, you can set your type styles, and then it's super easy to change them later. Same thing in InDesign, same thing in Adobe Illustrator. Learn to set your styles, because it's going to make your life so much easier. I found this interesting too. This is new, this inclusive design. And let's go ahead and look at this page first, because I think seeing the example will make things make much more sense without having to read all of these. But I think these are good tips, very good start for anyone who wants to be more inclusive with their design. And you can see here, it's like, don't use a click here button. Like we've all seen like links where it's like, if you want to do this, click here. It's vague. It doesn't help screen readers. It doesn't, like, you don't know what click here does. Save for later, like these two actions look the same as opposed to join now or save for later. And like the buttons look markedly different. You know, the different things where it here says like your birthday in this space here, but then in this one here it says your birthday and it's got like DD, MM, year. So you know what format to use. And I know we're getting a little bit beyond like what we think of as typography, but this is typography. This is how you use your typeface, how you use your typography in context. And I think that this does a great job of scratching the surface of inclusive design and kind of showcasing how you can use typography to create better layouts or better, you know, book design in general. Like we've got our numbers down here. Like I said before, we've got these different things that kind of help us scan the page. It doesn't have to just be a form like this. Understanding that we should try to make things as easy to use as possible. The one thing that I disagree on this page is write in plain language, use simple sentences and familiar words to reach everyone. You know, if that was meant to be used, maybe this is specifically meant for like forms and stuff. But I think just to push back on this so that we don't accept this as a blanket statement, I don't think that, you know, we should write in plain language because technical terms should be used and should be understood by people working in certain industries. And I don't think we should dumb down stuff just so that someone who doesn't understand the technical terms can, like, you know, read whatever we're trying to read. The other thing is, if you're writing a novel, why should we not use adjectives? Why should we not make things fun? Why should we not make things emotional? That just, and maybe I'm misunderstanding what the use case is here, but it's not necessarily telling us. And I think that could be misconstrued and we could end up having like a lot of really, really boring typography, a lot of boring body copy and stuff used. But I agree with everything else, and I think this is a great addition. Another exercise, what do I think about those? Give or take. Multiplicity of Scripts. This is hands down the biggest addition in the 3rd edition. When Ellen Lupton did that presentation that I was talking about earlier, where she was talking about monospace fonts finally being included, she did a Q&A section at the end, and someone asked her, like, what's the biggest addition that you're proud of? What are you most, I think she was asked, what are you most proud of about this 3rd edition? Like, what's the biggest improvement? And she said she was most proud of these non-Latin typography sections being included. A few minutes later, she was asked what language, which typography was her favorite. It's non-Latin. And she said, well, I only speak English, so Latin. Like she doesn't speak any of these languages. She doesn't read any of these typography, any of this writing, any of this typography. So as I pointed out before, these sections are written and designed by others. And while I do think that delegating to these sections to people who are better suited at explaining them, I think that it also, she wrote this book. I'm going to backtrack so that I can try and make my point here. She wrote this book called Type on Screen, but she didn't actually write the book. It was a bunch of grad students that wrote different chapters and different pieces of it. And she was the editor of it. She wrote the introduction and she kind of pieced this book together that all these other people had written. That book, compared to Thinking with Type, is just, I don't know, if this is like an A tier book, that was like a C or a D tier book, maybe a D tier book. This here doesn't turn this book into like a D tier book, and the sections aren't like D tier, but I think these are like it's just not the same. It's just not the same. Imagine reading a novel and then halfway through it, there's like 30 pages that are written by 5 different other people. It just doesn't feel the same. It's not cohesive. And I think one of the problems with these sections is that they feel like individual essays that were written by these individuals who chose what they found to be the most important parts, and they may very well be the most important parts of each of these type systems, but they're not necessarily cohesive. So we looked at Arabic, now we're looking at Chinese. They don't feel like they don't have the same structure. They each have these little introductions, which are nice. But then when you go through and look at the different makeup of them, I know it's probably difficult, right? It's probably difficult because they're completely different systems. You can't make it the same structure, but it just feels very difficult to follow along. And I don't think that, like I said before, I don't think anyone's going to be testing on this in classrooms. I just, maybe some of the basic stuff, but I don't think they're going to be testing on the structure and the letter forms and things like that. So whether or not this is worth 30 plus pages of the book, I mean, that's up to each person to decide. But after reading this book 3 times, I have come to the conclusion that I do think that this is a good inclusion in the book, good addition to the 3rd edition. If for no other reason than you get an introduction to some of these other things. And I love this. And I love that, like, I'll just go ahead and say this, the 5 basic consonants of Korean typography. And Korean typography, as far as I understand, as far as what I've read in this book, is like the only one that I'm aware of, or at least it was the first one that was created, that was in print before it was written. So a lot of typography, especially when we look back at Arabic, this is all handwritten, handwriting that was turned into typefaces. Korean, and it's very easy when you see the structure here, these letter forms, was created to be printed. Again, I don't speak Korean, I don't write Korean. This is my understanding based on reading the book. But gosh, it just looks so cool, and it's so easy to understand the concept of how it was built. I think this alone is worth these sections so that you can kind of understand how other typefaces were built, even if you never learned to read Korean, even if you never learned to read Arabic, even if you never need to deal with Indic typography. It's still cool to understand a little bit of another culture, a little bit of another system. And there are very useful things like aligning the X height, aligning vertical layouts and things like that. So it will be useful if you're ever going to be working with international typography. But I think there could have just been a little bit more cohesion. And one of the things that I wish all of these had is what the Korean section does, and that is adding sources. So they have sources at the end of theirs. They're the only one that did this. There are some others that have further reading, similar to how Ellen Lupton does hers. But I think that this really makes a big difference because obviously you're not going to learn everything you need to know about Korean typography. You get some sources here, a little bit of further reading, and I think it's nice to have that citation section. I think the Japanese section is probably the best structured, but I wish that it had the sources at the end as well. So it just gives you a little bit of introduction, shows you some of the glyphs, shows you how to use these characters, type design innovations, and it's in and out. It's just done. I wish that that's how they all were, but like I said, they're going to be designed differently. I know I have a lot of viewers in India. Hello. You can let me know how well done you think this section is if you've read the book, or if you can just kind of, take away what you can right now and see if you think that it's well done or not, because I'm just not sure. And when I was trying to read these sections, I'll be honest, my eyes started to glaze over, not on this Indic typography particularly, but just, 30 pages about languages that you don't speak. By the time you get to this typeface for Africa, it's just information overload, and it's information that you're probably never going to use in your entire life. So it's like you're trying to absorb this thing that isn't as useful as the rest of the book. So you'll have to decide for yourself whether or not this section of the book is worth upgrading for you. I think that even if you don't care about that, the 3rd edition is still worth purchasing because it's been 14 years since the 2nd edition was written, and a lot has changed. And, I pointed out a lot of the big upgrades that we've seen in this 3rd edition. So regardless of the international typography, for the, English or Latin Latin typography users, I think that this is still a great book, even if you're going to skip that section entirely. Moving on to layouts. So, we've been building up. We started with letters, text. Now we're getting into the layout section, and we're going to start looking at how to piece together everything we've learned in the previous sections. Dividing space, this is how to do page layouts. This section here is from a diagram from the New Typography book. I don't think there's necessarily anything wrong with breaking up your pages like that, but this is clearly more dynamic. There's a place for both of these though, obviously. We can start to see a little bit of the grid here, grid as a program, and you can see some of the Swiss design. And if you want to see what I think is probably the best book on this, go look up Josef Müller-Brockmann. I have a full book review of that. I think it's the most popular video on the channel as of now. So people do find it very useful. And I found that book super interesting. I think if you're interested in the grid, if you see these pages and you like the way the typography is structured here, that's definitely worth checking out. Universal layout, we're kind of looking here at moving beyond the page, because it's easy to talk about the layout of this, but then when we start talking about a website, you have to think about how is it laid out on a phone versus a tablet versus maybe a smartwatch or like a PC screen or, a vertical monitor, horizontal monitor. Like you have to have these responsive web layouts. And you have to give up a little bit of control on how your type is set and how your fonts are going to resize and things like that. So super important to take note of that. But again, we're just going to scratch the surface with everything in this book. Now we're going to get into balance and alignment. Symmetry and asymmetry. I really like this debate. Personally, I like symmetrical stuff. I don't know why, I just do. I remember in my art classes, the teacher showed us like asymmetrical designs and symmetrical designs and was like, everyone here likes this, right? And I was like, no, I like the symmetrical one better. I just like that perfect balance. But it's hard to deny that this is much more dynamic. This is much more emotional. It's much more engaging. But it just depends on what type of engagement you want, I think. And it depends on, you're not going to have it like we talked about earlier with the centered justification. What am I trying to say? The centered typography, you're not going to typeset a tombstone asymmetrically. I don't know. I guess maybe somebody might. I think this is another great spread in this book, this grouping section, because it's something that you've probably intuited, but maybe you didn't necessarily, you didn't consciously think of, but you've probably felt it before. And grouping is super cool. This Gestalt psychology, let's go ahead and look at the next page because I think this demonstrates it even better than the introduction. And you can group things like in columns like this, and you can use different colors, right? You can see how this could be like a header versus the body copy, kind of grouping that. You can group one little thing right in the middle there, and it draws your attention to it and emphasizes that. There's all these different ways to group things, and then she gives examples on good and bad ways to do it. So very interesting. Again, scratch on the surface, something I think is worth looking into. I'm personally going to look into this a lot more myself, but just the psychology of grouping things is very, very interesting. Aligning elements. You can add a lot of character and a lot of headaches if you don't align things correctly. So here you can kind of see the different options for adding a caption to a photo. And I think in most situations, these can all, in any given situation, these could all make sense, but there's going to be probably one that works the best. So here we've got the caption up here in the top right because we've got these three laid out like this. You wouldn't try to squeeze this over here and then just have a giant blank space. So I think it's cool that she's kind of giving this little diagram, but then showcasing different ways to align your text, your captions and things like that. Borders. borders are something that seems super outdated in one sense, because I don't know, when you start learning design, you're kind of taught not to use borders, but then you think about buttons and you think about comic books and you think about like, I don't know, different, spreadsheets or different cool things like this, where they've just added all these borders. I think there are creative ways to do everything, and I like that she includes this in the book. And we might not think of borders as being typography, but borders have always been a part of like printed pages. It's always, if you look at the old manuscripts, they've got these borders on them, and it was because it was just like a big press that would stamp down on the page. But we use them all the time, and when they're done well, we don't notice them at all. Think about every button that's on a web page or an app or on your phone or anything. We use borders all the time, and it's important to be able to use them well and to put your typography into them in a way that makes sense. Grids. We've been dancing around this for the entire book. We're finally here. Like I said, I think that the best place to go look at grids is Josef Mueller-Brockmann's grid systems. But we are going to look at scratching the surface here. Again, we've got manuscript grids. That's basically just going to be like a 1-column grid. And she makes some important points here about designing spreads. Like I said, that's going to be explored more in other books. But you kind of get an idea about like what you need to be thinking about, even if you don't fully understand, understand every single piece about that subject. Column grids, we've all seen this in newspapers, magazines, usually not on websites, but this is more of a printed thing. Modular grid. This one here is a little bit frustrating for me, only because I think this is here intentionally to be complex, and it seems so needless. If you are brand new to grids, ignore this page, please, because this is not what grids are. I think that if she wanted to be useful here, she could have used different colors to demonstrate where the grid is breaking down. This is looked at also in Grid Systems, the book that I keep mentioning. But this here is like a super complex grid, similar to this. And you've got all these overlapping grids. Basically, you take a grid and then you stick a grid on top of it. This isn't helpful. If anything, this drives people away from grids. Please don't be driven away from grids because they can be very useful, very powerful. Ignore this page. Modular grids, though, are great, and I'm going to show you a great example, and it's this one right here. I happen to have this book. So this is a book that's in Portuguese, Brazilian Portuguese, and she's pointing out here the modular grid. When you see this, you don't even necessarily know. We got like a book review inside of a book review, right? This is actually 2 separate books inside of this sort of like plastic. And the cool thing about this is you've got these lines here. I'll just show you one because both books are kind of the same. And you've got this layout. That's the layout she's showing here. The modular grid inside of here is that these sections here align with the written stuff inside of here. So you see this here. 30,000 pace. A 30,000 pace. 3 dias in, I don't know how to say 1001. But you look right there. 3 dias. Let's find one more. Here's one. Escrita à mão. You go to the front. Oops, we lost it. Escrita à mão. I think this is super cool. And it's a very good example of like a modular grid that can be very engaging. And it's one of those things that you're not necessarily going to, it's not super important. It doesn't change anything, but it is kind of this fun piece of design that's just a little bit more interesting than sticking all of your titles at the top. They could have easily just stuck every title in the corner right there, but it's kind of fun that they're different on all the pages, but it still has like a cohesive structure that makes sense. because you've got your typography in the middle, and then you're sticking, these just correlate to where the title is on each page. Really love that. Baseline grid. This is something I did not grasp when I was a student. I just didn't. And I didn't understand why anyone cared about it. She does a great job of kind of sneaking in that she's been using a baseline grid throughout the entire book, because I'm not sure how well you'll be able to see on the screen, but she's got these little lines here that demonstrate where the baseline grid is, and all the captions, all the body text, all of the headers here, they all line up on this grid, and it can make your typography just look very cohesive. It balances well. It feels right. I don't know, like a better way to say it. It just feels right. And you can see another example of it here that's a little more explicit, where you've got the header here that lines up on each of those lines, and then you've got your subheads that still line up on it, and then you've got your body copy where they all line up on the baseline grid. So you're not going to learn how to construct a baseline grid. You're not going to learn how to use a baseline grid, but you can kind of get an idea of what it is. Basically, everything lines up on these horizontal lines, and it just makes the typography fit better together. It gives you a system where you're not guessing about where to place anything. It goes on the grid. Responsive layouts. We talked about this a little bit before when we were talking about the universal design. You're going to have to give up a little bit of the control, but it's mandatory to learn how to do this if you want to exist on the internet. And last, this book really does go out in a whimper. It does not go out in a bang. And this has been a problem for all three versions of the book. None of them have a conclusion. It's insane to me that one of the most popular graphic design, one of the most popular typography books in modern times, in 20 years has not found a way to conclude their book. She has not found a way to conclude her book other than to just end on any random, whatever topic she's ending on. So this one's serial design. The last one was not serial design. And it's not even important enough to talk about what this is. But that's the end of the book. We get to, I guess technically we end on an exercise, but like I said, so you just finish your exercise and then you're in the index. So we don't have to end on a sour note though. We don't have to end on a sour note. I don't like this ending. I want a conclusion. Humans love conclusions. We watch TV shows and they leave on it and if they end on it to be continued, if it leaves on a cliffhanger, we want more. We want to know the ending. What's the ending? We love TV shows that are episodic, that have a beginning, middle, and end. And at the end of the episode, we get some kind of peace, some kind of resolution. There's no resolution here. So I will be critical of that until the day that I die. But it's cool that she gives the shout out to the contributors here. Most of these are the people who wrote the non-Latin typography sections. And then the index. This is why I'm saying we don't have to end on a sour note. The index is great. We don't have the bibliography, but we do have the index. And you're not going to be able to read this probably. Typeface names in red. So you can go through, and if you want to look up, if you're looking for a specific font that's used in the book, or you just want to see what fonts were used in the book, you can go find them. They're all in red, which I think is really cool. And then, like I said before, any of these terms that you go look up, when we go look them up, you find the pages, they are in red. So it's super easy to go from the index to the word that you're looking for. Love that. One of the best, many other books could learn from that. I know that a lot of education books have that when you're a kid, a student in elementary school and stuff, but you don't see that in a lot of professional level books. And I appreciate that this one does have it. And lastly, what we typically see as front matter. I can't think of what this is called. A colophon? Someone can correct me, whatever this is called. But she's got the typefaces that are used in the book and in the cover. And I think that that's really cool. So that if you want to see what typefaces were used to create the cover, like I did when I made the thumbnail for this video, she makes it super easy for you. And I appreciate anytime that a book notes what typefaces were used. And I think that should be common practice at this point. I know France has laws about it. You actually have to put that in there. But I do think that it's a nice thing to have. I don't know that it needs to be a law, but I do think it's nice. And we've got the little fold out here. So as you may have guessed, after making 2 videos and this one being a very long flip through review, I do recommend this book. And I do recommend the 3rd edition. If you want one of the older editions because you think it looks cool, or you don't want the, some of the cultural stuff that's in this one, that's fine. Go buy the 2nd edition, go buy the 1st edition, and have them as like a historical piece. But understand that this is objectively, I have to say subjectively, right? But I feel like it's almost objectively the best one. And here's why. Better structure, better layout, better examples. We've got those printed examples from the Letterform archive. Up to date in terms of technology, up to date in terms of having like more topics covered. And then you get the non-Latin typography too. So I just think objectively, this has the most amount of content. It also has the most relevant for 2025 content. And it does the best job of laying it out. It's the best designed version of this book. It's the best written version of this book. And I do not think that you'll be disappointed in buying this book. So I will have a link. That link will help support the channel. I have been Curtis Simpson, and this was the Jectives Flip Through Review of Ellen Lupton's Thinking with Type, 3rd edition.